Thank you, Iju, for the kind introduction. I start with the acknowledgement to the Jaguar and the Turrbal people of Meanjin, that is Brisbane, and pay my respects to elder past and present and emerging. Okay, let's start. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the mechanisms of mind, and I'll talk about a few things. Okay, so that's the agenda for today. So I'm going to start with the introduction to connectivity. Then I'll talk about two things. One are the mechanistic models for inference, yeah, and then I'll go towards large-scale deep learning-based foundation models for prediction. So that's the theme: inference, mechanistic, and foundation models where we do prediction or classification problems. And then if the mechanistic models are too abstract and the foundation models too opaque, I hope that once we get to the psychedelics, everything becomes deeply meaningful. And then I'll talk about what's next, which is using the understanding from mechanisms and predictions about the brain, and use this to train and develop next generation AI solutions. This is what we call the near AI. Okay, let's start with the introduction first. Okay, so here we go. We have three different types of connectivity. So we usually refer to this as structural, functional, and effective connectivity. Structural connectivity refers to the presence of axonal connections, physical connections, white matter fiber tracks that can be traced with DTI. So these are like roads in a city, static there, yeah. Functional connectivity, again, using this cartoon, three brain regions. Here we use the time series to find the statistical dependencies between bold signals. As you see, by definition, there are no directions, there are correlations. I'll talk about it a lot more during the talk. And then the last one, that's where the inference part comes in. This is where we look at the causal or directed connections or influences between these brain regions. Importantly, these are at the neuronal level, so these are not at the board level. These are the hidden interactions that we're trying to infer. They are directed and have the valency. For example, they can be inhibitory and excitatory. What I'll do is, in this talk, is to connect all these three. Yeah? Okay, so this is the first, here I'm introducing a connectivity as a reconstruction problem. Some of the work by my research fellow, Dr. Novelli, he showed that while we can use these two brain regions like X1 and X2, for example, here we have this this generative model, so-called, where we have X dot, which is the time derivative of the activity in these brain regions, and then there is this effective connectivity, which we show as asymmetric and inhibitory, excitatory connection and inhibitory connection, as shown here. This results, if you want to look at the X1, if we look at the X1 and X2 activity on a phase plot, on the phase diagram, you can see this gradient field which is deterministic. So for these numbers, there is a deterministic path. If you move these numbers around, you can get many other solutions. Now this becomes a lot more interesting once we introduce what we call neural fluctuations. So these are state noise, U or V, as I will call later on. As you see, depending on what the level and the sort of noise that we have, this becomes a stochastic trajectory. This goes through the HRF, and with some noise, this gives you the bold signal. And from the bold signal, you can get these functional connectivity. As you see, this functional connectivity is symmetric, yeah? But the relationship between this effective and functional connectivity is not one-to-one. This is what we call the connectivity reconstruction problem, and I'll talk a bit more about this, that this relationship is not one-to-one. It is an ill-posed problem that we usually solve using dynamic causal modeling in this situation. I give another example where now I have 3 brain regions. What I do is this, that I fix one of the connectivity between X1 and X2. This is what I call A21. I keep it fixed. In this A matrix, I keep it variable, and keep everything else fixed, yeah? Now, what we do is this, that we vary the values of A21, only this thing, and from this we get the correlations, yeah? And you see this, these as row 1, 2, row 1, 3, and row 2, 3. Here you have A21 as function of these 3 correlation values, and now you can clearly see that the relationship between A21 and those correlations is not a linear relationship. So lots of people ask if there's an observed functional connectivity, how the effective connectivity would look like. It would depend on the data. It would not be a one-to-one relationship. For example, in this one, if I vary A21 from 0 to 1, so for example, going from 0 to 1, you would expect that the largest correlation would be row 1, 2. However, you see that when I vary this from 0 to 1, the largest value is actually row 2, 3, which is 0.78. So that's the point I'm trying to make here. The latent dynamics, they have a relationship with observed functional connectivity, which is degenerate. Okay. Here, an interesting observation that this neural fluctuations that I was talking about, they have, depending on the anatomical valence, this is what I'm going to talk about next, this characterized the spectral profile of these neural fluctuations. They could go from white, flat to pink and brown, and these are some of these variations of these based on the color of it. Here, there's a slide which shows that you have to start at the top with a state space model like dynamic causal model. If you start here at the top, that's something that Pedro Valdesora has always been arguing for, that you have to start with the state space model. If you have this one, you can analytically calculate any of the second order or time-based or frequency-based representations. Either they can be cross correlations or cross covariance, cross correlations, Granger causality, coherence, and so on. All these can be derived from a state space model, and this is a one-way street. You have to go from here to here. You cannot go back. There's a one-way street. You start here, you cannot recover the underlying dynamics. Okay, that's now a bit of an introduction. Now I go a bit more into the mechanistic models or dynamic causal models. So here I show a standard dynamic causal model where we are modeling the endogenous fluctuations or the neural fluctuations. You start with these neural fluctuations. They perturb the brain, which is modeled as a first order differential equation here. These are the parameters theta, which are the connectivity or the causes, or effective connectivity or the causes. This gives rise to the bold signal from which you can get the functional connectivity. The main idea here is that you do a model inversion where you go from these observations back to the causes. This is a problem which we call the Bayesian model inversion, where you learn the posteriors and also you rate or score each of the causes by using what we call the log model evidence or the free energy. Based on which cause has the highest evidence, you get the winning model, or many other times you have lots of models with similar evidence, so you do a Bayesian model averaging. So this is a generic framework, Bayesian framework for regularizing this inverse problem, hard inverse problem, into something that we can deal with. Okay, so recently what we have done, most of the work is done by Matthew Greaves, so he's a PhD student in the lab, where he's looking at structurally informed models of effective connectivity. So what we do here, he has proposed 3 different approaches in the literature. For example, the first one, where we look at using structural connectivity to provide prior on the effective connectivity by using a linear transformation between the prior and the variance. So this is an idea here where we use the structural connections to regularize the prior evidence for a certain connection. What we do is that is a hierarchical model using empirical base. We start with a standard spectral DCM, for example, in this case. We use subject level connectivity, do the inversion, then we go to the second level where in the step one, we use a structure-based priors that constrain the group level fixed effect model using a subject-based posteriors as the likelihood. So here we go from here. We do this at the third level. We do this prior variance transformation, which is linear, and then we do another inversion using these at the group level, and from this we get a subject level structure-informed effective connectivity. There's a bit of a convoluted method, but it really works well. We show some simulations here. Most of the work here is on the other extreme of what Paul was showing yesterday, which is lots of data, lots of authors. Most of the work here uses simulations and only a couple of authors. Here, for example, in the simulations, no data here. We use a ground truth structural connectivity and effective connectivity, and we show that using this method we can recapitulate the ground truth quite well with a R of 0.77, and then we compare it with a box standard directed functional connectivity using multivariate autoregressive model. We show that the proposed method, which we call the hierarchical empirical base, works quite well. Here we have these simulated subjects, and we show that the Pearson R is quite high for the hierarchical model compared to the MVR model. We then provide a criterion validity here using a well-known gradient where we show that the structure function changes, coupling differences, recapitulate a well-known trajectory from unimodal areas to a more transmodal default mode network areas like this, and there is quite a significant relationship between the two. Now, this method works really well. However, there are lots of heuristic involved here because we have to find these transformations between variance and the prior and the variance, and it requires some tweaking. So what we do is that we propose, actually Matthew proposes another way in which we use an empirical evidence from literature which says that the structural valence, like this, the structural connectivity, it characterizes the profile of the spectral properties of the endogenous fluctuations. So here we use a structural connectivity. For example, this node has high structural valence. It results in certain characteristics. You could see we go from white to pinkish to brown noise, and these fluctuations then enter our forward model, and we get the bold responses. We provide a bit of a constructor of phase validation where we use again the simulations to show that the method recapitulates the ground truth pretty well. We use structural connections, effective connectivity, and for example, here we show it works pretty well as the network size grows from 5 to 15 regions, especially when we use the group level RFX modeling, and then here we show that the effective connectivity and the spectral mapping, they faithfully recover here, and we can also get the group differences. For example, we have two groups here which may represent the healthy controls and disease population, and we also show that we can recapitulate, we can recover the underlying group differences as well. Then we use provide cross-validation using a model of Hopf oscillator, very well known, where we show that this could be a generic model where the underlying neural dynamics recapitulate again some sort of a structure function mapping. Here we show that it is also that there's some near critical dynamics like metastability arises as well as a function of a bifurcation parameter. We then also show that this works pretty well with different signal to noise ratios and so on. Then we look at cross species comparison. So in this chromatic DCM, we use humans and macaques and marmosets and mouse tractograms, and we then use homologous regions from them, and we show that we show a conserved effective connectivity across them, and there is the spectral the structural valency and the spectral as function spectral exponent as a function of structural valency. It also aligns quite well as well. You see structural connectome over the whole brain, and then the inferred effective connectivity here. So this shows quite promising results. Then there are some emerging directions. For example, what we're showing here is that these models can be used for hierarchical models like these, where you can predict the parameters and phenotypes. For example, there's a current work by Tamron Barta in the lab, and she has a poster here as well, where she's using this structure function coupling to predict Huntington disease phenotype profiles. Then people have also used some graph theoretic measures like communicability to integrate these into the structure function coupling and so on. Then I quickly move to from inference part, which are mechanistic models, or explainable models, to more foundational models or AI-based or deep neural network-based models of prediction and classification. So in this work, for example, some early work uses time series from different brain regions to construct static graphs of functional connectivity, and use these to learn and predict certain things, like, for example, the age or the biomarkers or disease progression and so on. These are some early models like a BrainNet CNN and Brain GNN, graph neural network-based models, which have been proved quite useful. But then there are some more recent models. For example, this one. This is what we call the Zebra with C. This uses contrastive learning to compress neural time series in a way to learn hidden structures. Here we are using here it is using rat hippocampal data, where rat is moving in a box, where from one side to another, and then there are neural time series here as well. I will show later on that this works pretty well with fMRI as well. But this method, Zebra, which is pretty popular now, it doesn't really track the temporal trajectories of single units, and also it also uses labels of behavior rather than using an unsupervised way to predict them. So to overcome these limitations, Muin and Farouk, who are the postdocs in my lab, they have used a model in which they use a dynamic graphs, where they use a window which moves across the time series using GNN, and then they use temporal attention and LNNs to model the dynamic effect, dynamic functional connectivity over time, and uses behavior in an unsupervised way. then we showed that this works pretty well in the same red hippocampal data set with Zebra, where we show that Zebra doesn't do well. As you could see, the time and the behavior, but you could see that Tervin is really, teasing apart different positions here, colored as pink and green and orange. And then we use another electrophysiological recording data from primate somatosensory cortex for a goal-directed reaching task, in which again, Zebra behavior and Zebra time doesn't do that well, while Tervin does quite well in distinguishing the underlying dynamics here. We then uses something what we call the in vitro cultured neurons in a dish, where we train them to play a game of Pong. And in this instance, we show that Zebra doesn't do well as much, while the Tervin again was able to learn underlying dynamics, where it can distinguish the those instances where the performance of these in vitro neurons was not as good in terms of playing the game compared to those instances where the hit to miss ratio was high. So this just shows that this method works pretty well. I'll show more of these examples in fMRI data later on. And then we do a comparison with some of the established models, so Tervin versus GraphERT, Dyna, ARN, and many others. So these are some of the baseline comparisons, and then there's whole shift in last couple of years towards more transformer-based models. So in these transformer-based models, what we do is this: we don't work with the graphs anymore, rather we use the ROI time series, and then it uses these attention mechanism to learn underlying dynamics. For example, this BNT model from Nirip's paper in 2022, and then this got defined by by this model, which actually, this uses the idea of a brain as a sequence to pre-train, to use self-supervised learning to pre-train this foundation model. Here, it uses, it masks some of the time series data to predict for training these transformers, and then it reconstruct these input data with this, and it works, and then it learns the underlying dynamics, which can then be used for downstream prediction of age or other things like gender or IQ and things like that. This was then refined by some of the beautiful work by Helen in BrainJapa, which defines this using this self-supervised learning, where they now, instead of learning or reconstructing time series, they learn some abstract feature space, and then it works up pretty well, even better than the previous models. However, these models are pretty large. They have hundreds of millions of parameters. What we propose is Brain Symphony. This is the work by Moin Khaja-Nejad, postdoc in my lab. He proposes to use three parallel streams of transformers: one for the spatial, for modeling or learning spatial dynamics, another for temporal dynamics, a temporal transformer, and then also a transformer for learning the context. So it uses these three parallel streams, combine them using a perceiver model, or a perceiver block, which uses the cross attention, and then gives a fixed size embeddings that can be then used for the downstream task. And then we also combine here. We use a structural information using a very novel signed graph transformer, where we use structural DTI data, but this can also model effective connectivity, because this is a signed graph transformer. You can replace this with, here you can replace the structural information with effective connectivity. activity and it would do equally well. So we use these perceiver output, which are the functional with the structural in this case, and then we combine them using an adaptive fusion model. And then this could be used to do some downstream task, and I'll show the prediction and classification performance a bit later in the slides. The good thing about this foundation model, that it is pretty small, lightweight, with about 6 to 8 billion parameters, compared to BrainJAPA, for example, which has about 100 million parameters. Then we show some performance measurements of Brain Symphony, where we predict the gender, as you see here, the fMRI model only, a diffusion model only in yellow, and the fusion model in purple. This would predict, it has very high accuracy when predicting, for example, the gender. And then we use both linear probing and fine-tuning. As we see, the fine-tuning is doing a bit better. Then we do more like age prediction and so on. Then we compare this with other, with the state of the art, for example, the BrainJAPA, BrainLM, and all those things. And what we show is the accuracy for gender prediction, for example, for gender classification is pretty high. Same as with the GH prediction, the MSE is pretty low for the fusion model, for example. Then we also show some of the comparisons again, the age MSE and the gender accuracy for our model, and compare it with the baselines. Okay, and then the last thing is this: we use this to predict time series data as well. And it does pretty well, as you could see. Okay, so this is more about the large transform-based models for prediction. These are very useful, but of course they are sort of a black box models where there is less mechanistic insights that you can get, but they do very well in terms of predicting and classification, whatever you want to do. For example, predict the trajectory of diseases and EDC. Okay, so now what I do is I use these models, both inference-based models and also the predictive models, to look at a novel data set of psychedelics that we have collected in the lab. So now I go to psychedelics part, where I use this as a working example. Okay, so I use psychedelics as a pathway to understand altered states of consciousness. Of course, psychedelics can have a lot of potential for therapeutics, for treating various mental health issues, but my interest in psychedelics is to use them as a perturbation of the brain's perception, and then image people while they have these subjective effects, and learn about the neural mechanisms of these subjective experiences. So there are quite a few models which are present in the field. Some of them are what we call as system-level gating models, like how the how the altered states of consciousness arises. For example, there is very popular corticostriatal-thalamocortical model, which was proposed by Franz Vollenweider and Mark Greer in 2001. We provided some of the early in vivo evidence for this model, and also there is a competing model which is about claustrum, where this is what we call the cortico-claustrocortical model. So these models are at the level of gating mechanisms, that how the psychedelics act in the brain, and I will provide some evidence for these. But then there are also these models of computational models of belief dynamics. For example, the relaxed beliefs under psychedelics model, called Rebus model, which improves upon or proceeds from the entropic brain hypotheses, and we'll talk a bit more about this as well. And there is a competing model from Phil Collett about the strong priors. So there are few models at this level, and then a couple of competing models that how at the neural circuitry level. So providing some evidence for the cortical striatal-thalamocortical circuit. This is some work by Catherine Preller, my colleague in Switzerland. What we did was to use to provide evidence for the thalamic filter model. What it is says is that thalamus works as a filter. All the sensory information passes through the thalamus. In usual condition, thalamus would block most of the information, while under psychedelics, this thalamus as a filter opens up and it lets a lot more information to the cortex than in usual conditions, and this results in psychedelic experience. We provided some, using DCM, using some inferential models, we provided some evidence that actually this is the case using a hypothesis-driven model of four brain regions where we have thalamus activity here in drug versus placebo condition, and there's a blockage condition. And what is showing that actually there's a lot more information going through the thalamus under the drug condition versus a placebo condition. This led Catherine to propose a working hypothesis of how psychedelic-induced changes in the brain connectivity works. So what she proposes is that there's these effects via the CSTC loop. The psychedelics would increase the functional connectivity between the thalamus and the sensory cortical regions. For example, the one in the purple, and then there's a decreased thalamic functional connectivity or effective connectivity between association areas, which are in blue here. Now, LSD shown to also increase the effective connectivity from thalamus to the posterior cingulate cortex, as I showed in the previous slide. And this reduction in thalamus filtering increases the information flow to particular areas of the cortex, and this leads to increased sensory processing, which is not counterbalanced by the integrative processing in the association cortex, and this disbalance results in a psychedelic experience. And then there's another competing model, as I said, about colostrum. This is some work by my student Naveed Masjidi, who did his master's thesis with us, and he looked at colostrum. This is really interesting because there's not much in literature about how colostrum is connected to the rest of the cortex. So this is one of the earliest, we think, is the evidence for how colostrum is connected with the rest of the with cortical regions in health first. So what it is showing that there's a structural connectivity between colostrum and the limbic and associative areas, which is bidirectional, while there is a unidirectional bottom-up connections from structural connections from subcortical regions to the colostrum. And similarly, these are reflected in the cellular level connectivity, which is dominated by the inhibitory interneurons. What we show is this, that in the default mode network across 7 Tesla HCP data set, there is this very stable pattern of connectivity, which is showing up across 7 Tesla, 3 Tesla, and also in a small data set with only 50 or 60 healthy controls. So what we are showing how the colostrum maps connect with the rest, with cortex here, and then we looked at these changes in connectivity across of colostrum connectivity under psilocybin, and it's really interesting that how this changes as in terms of various different larger scale networks. And it's quite stable as we have shown here. We have replicated these findings in other data sets as well. Okay, so these are some empirical evidence for the gating or circuit gating level models. Now, of course, there are, as I discussed, some computational models of belief dynamics. The most popular one is the Rebus model, which is basically proposed as a unified therapeutic theory. It uses the predictive coding framework and says that the brain constructs the best top-down explanations for bottom-up sensor input at each level of the hierarchy in order to make accurate inferences. So here we show the cortex, the whole brain as a pyramid where you are getting sensory information which is going bottom-up, and there is a top-down predictions. So this is the high-level inferences hypothesis or what's happening at the level of self in a most philosophical connotation. Then under psychedelics, what happens is that these top-down predictions have suppressive function on the bottom of sensory signaling, and this the highest level relate to the conscious executive function and self-evidence. So what we are saying is that this hierarchy in the psychedelics, it flattens. Yeah. So for example, in these different internalizing disorders like depression, usually what happens is that people have beliefs which are rigid, and they're sort of in a rut. So the psychedelics provides them with a way to have provide different hypotheses or explanations for the things happening around them. So this provides new insights and a different way to explore the opportunity, an opportunity to explore various landscapes of alternative hypotheses. So this is quite influential. However, as I go through different sort of literature, you see lots of inconsistencies in terms of the whole brain dynamics. I'm moving to some global functional global brain connectivity results or empirical findings from literature. And as you see, this is the work from Praller and from Timmerman. So these are two competing groups, one in Switzerland and one at Imperial in England now, and at UCSF, and they show very different, very different patterns. So you see where things are getting up, here getting down, and all those differences, and also they are function of if you do GSR or not. So currently, the state of the field is this: that the current models only describe the models of disintegration. For example, they talk about thalamic gating failures. For example, as I was showing before, relaxed priors, overweighted priors, clustrum decoupling, for example. So this is all about those models of disintegration, and then they don't explain how coherent and transformative therapeutic experience arises from psychedelics. There's gap there, and they are inconsistent, as I was saying. And one of the another limitation is this: that all these models, all these data sets are pretty small. They come from studies with 15 to 30 participants, and they also don't have contextual manipulation. So what we did was to collect a large-scale data set in our lab. This is what we call PsyConnect, which is the acronym for psilocybin connectivity and context. What we did is to have 60 people in this. So it is twice as large as any of the current data sets. We had two groups in this, where half of the people did meditation and others didn't do meditation. They all went through a baseline MRI session where they had resting state scan, a meditation scan, a music scan, and a movie watching as well. And then they were given a dose of about 19 milligram of psilocybin, and then we repeated all the MRI measurements. And then we collected a bunch of behavioral data as well. What we show is this very, very consistent findings. We show an increase in global functional connectivity in the associative areas, while decrease in connectivity in the posterior sensory areas. What we also show is this: that under eyes closed condition, eyes open condition, which is the movie watching, versus the 3 eyes closed conditions, you could see there is a clear distinction. Interestingly, under the baseline condition, the eyes closed, which is the eyes closed condition, which are the green and the other colors, while the purple is the eyes open condition and the movie watching. They were quite distinct, while under psilocybin, they kind of overlap now, which shows that it doesn't matter in the psychedelics that you have eyes open or eyes closed. The internal world overlaps with the external reality. And then we looked at some of the predictive models that I was talking about, like Zebra. For example, here, what I'm showing here is this no psilocybin condition and psilocybin condition, and this is going up is the mystical experiences score. So these are the people with lowest score. These are people with the highest score. So these are some plots where we show that Zebra was able to find these embeddings where we can see that these four conditions, the rest, meditation, music, and movie watching, they can be really distinguished when the experience was positively felt and high. Now, in this condition, as you see, the MEQ score is really high, but still we don't see the clear demarcation between different contexts. This was because this person didn't have the experience before in the scanner. So similarly, we use Tavern that I was showing to look at the temporal dynamics and so on. We also look at some of the phenomenological effect in the psilocybin. I don't have time to go through all of these. We looked at anterior hippocampus and default mode connectivity and shows differences based on context. And then we looked at EEG data as well. The important thing is this: we now provide a more of a framework, what we call embeddedness, which describes a hidden neural organization that emerges from the desynchronized, disintegrated state, but only when the experience is boundary dissolving and positively felt. So embeddedness as a framework describes psychedelic experience. This data set is also openly available on OpenNeuro. Once it passes through the peer review, the data set will be available, hopefully within a month or two for any of you to use this as much as you like. What next? We are taking all of this to a future direction where we look at NeuroAI. NeuroAI is not about applying AI to brain data, but it is an interdisciplinary approach to understand intelligence, to uncover universal principles of learning, perception, decision making across biological and artificial systems. And this is seen as a revival of cybernetics and connectionism paradigms. What I'm trying to show here quickly, I have only a few seconds left, that current models have sustainability issues in AI. They use, so for example, this project by OpenAI and Microsoft proposes 5 nuclear plants to run millions of GPUs. This is really nice work by Ursula Hölzl, where she shows that as the number of neurons increases, the power consumption is linear function. Yeah, this is biology. This is evolution, which has this energy conservation, where the number of neurons has increased from mouse to humans. There's a linear scaling, while the current AI has quadratic number of units. So, if, for example, if instead of having this linear relationship, we had this quadratic relationship, the nature has, or the biology, or the human brains had the quadratic linear relationship, then instead of using 20 volts, 25 volts, we would be using as much energy as used by United States. So these are the laws that we are looking at. This summarizes the whole neuromorphic computing, where the whole goal is to go towards this linear scaling from quadratic scaling. So this is where we are heading towards. We have started doing these NeuroAI workshops. For example, this one we did at NeurIPS in 2024. This has more than 1,400 participants. Where we had, for example, lots of people ask me that Carl is not showing up at OHBM. He actually now shows up at NeurIPS, where we are doing things like these. Is Carl with us in December? Is Terry Sejnowski, whose paper on restricted Boltzmann machine was the focal reference for the Nobel Prize in physics and AI, and so on. So this is what's happening these days in our lab, which we are very very excited about. And with that, there is, if you would like to take a picture of various posters and talks that my lab is giving during the conference. And with that, I would like to thank my lab and many of my collaborators. This talk is dedicated to the memory of my dear friend, Dr. Anisul Karim, who unfortunately died in a road accident on Friday. So we are still trying to process what this means. With that, I would like to thank everyone.